The air in New Inverness, 1869, was a perpetual gray blend of prairie dust and the lingering acrid smell of burnt wood. 2 years had passed since the fire, yet the scent, like the memory of the McLennan family, refused to fully dissipate. Elara McLennan, barely 20, scraped the last of the breakfast oats into a chipped bowl. The small, isolated cabin she shared with her distant, taciturn aunt, Morag, offered little comfort against the late autumn chill. Outside, the land stretched featureless and vast, hemmed in by the oppressive silent community of Scottish Highlanders who settled this harsh corner of the American Midwest. The architecture of New Inverness reflected their ancestral homeland. Small, sturdy stone or heavy timber structures with steeply pitched roofs designed to withstand a harsher climate than the prairie, yet built with an inherent unyielding rigidity. "You're too slow, lass," Morag's voice, sharp and dry as old parchment, cut through the quiet. "The market will close before you get a shilling for the lace." "I'm going, Aunt," Elara mumbled, tying the coarse shawl around her shoulders. She knew the lace wouldn't sell. People in New Inverness, particularly the stern elders, avoided dealing with her. The McLennan name, once respected for its ambition and modern thinking, was now a curse, a whispered synonym for tragedy, madness, and unspeakable loss. Her parents, her younger brother, and 2 cousins all perished in a rapid, consuming fire that officially, according to the hurried report drafted by the town council and the local, easily pliable justice of the peace, was an unfortunate accident. A misplaced lantern, they said. But Elara, who remembered the unnerving silence of the night, the locked doors, and the too calm demeanor of the first responders, knew better. She remembered the official ruling, issued mere hours after the bodies were pulled from the smoldering ruin, smelling not just of smoke, but of a calculated, hasty finality. She walked the dusty main track, the silence of the town heavier than the fog that clung to the fringes of the settlement. Every pair of eyes she passed looked through her or away, a practiced cold ostracization that had become her constant companion. The women pulled their children closer. The men averted their gaze with an almost religious fervor. At the edge of the track, near the newly erected livery stable, stood a man who was undeniably new. Sheriff Elias Thorne had arrived a week ago, sent from the territorial capital with explicit, if vague, instructions to bring genuine law and order to the rapidly expanding territories. He was a man of logic and procedure, a veteran of the East Coast legal system, and he viewed the insular community of New Inverness with professional skepticism. He noticed Elara instantly, not because of the pitying glances directed at her, but because of the defiance in her posture, a stubborn resistance that mirrored the way the prairie grass fought through the hard ground. "Excuse me, miss," Thorne called out, his voice clear and carrying, unlike the usual mumbles of the townsfolk. Elara stopped, her heart a sudden loud drum against her ribs. "McLennan," she corrected, her voice steady despite the apprehension. "Elara McLennan. Our tea taste." Thorne approached, removing his hat. "Sheriff Elias Thorne. I'm new to New Inverness. I've been reviewing the local records. A lot of missing pieces in the paperwork here. Highly irregular." He paused, letting his gaze convey his sincerity. The wind picked up, swirling a mix of dust and ash around them, a chilling reminder of the very subject he raised. "The file on the fire, the tragedy at your family's homestead 2 years ago, it's thin. The cause was ruled accidental, a lantern. But the details are sparse, and the investigation seems to have been concluded within the same day. Do you know who conducted the official inquiry?" Elara felt a sudden electric surge of hope and fear. No one had ever dared to question the official story in front of her. "Elder MacLeod and Justice of the Peace Grant," she whispered, her eyes darting to the windows of the general store where she sensed watchful eyes. "They signed the papers, said it was God's will and a faulty lamp." "God's will doesn't generally produce a signed and sealed report in under 12 hours, Miss McLennan," Thorne said, his tone devoid of judgment but sharp with implication. And I found a disturbing detail in the structural diagrams. The original homestead had 2 exits. Both were reportedly jammed shut from the outside. Your family, I understand, had a reputation for differences with the current leadership. The fear solidified into a paralyzing dread. Thorne had seen what no one else would look at: the locked doors. They had a difference of opinion, Ilara confirmed, her voice barely audible. My father wanted to move the town council into the new century, less tradition, more trade, less church control over daily life. MacLeod and his faction did not approve. My father was accused of sowing seeds of discord, of questioning the faith of the forefathers. Thorne nodded slowly, replacing his hat. I'm not here to judge local politics, Miss McLennan. I'm here to judge facts, and the facts of that fire don't sit right. A thorough investigation was never conducted. I intend to change that. He held her gaze, his eyes resolute. The emotional intensity of the moment was palpable, a stark contrast to the desolate prairie landscape. I understand this must be difficult, but I believe your family was not a victim of a mere accident. I believe the McLennan name holds a terrible secret that this town decided to bury to protect its own unblemished image. The climate of this place, the fear and the silence, suggests something monstrous. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice further. Do you think you could tell me everything you remember about the days leading up to the fire? Every strange look, every hushed word, every single detail. We must be methodical, Miss McLennan. We must be more patient than the prairie. Ilara looked down the track towards the charred patch of earth where her home once stood. The silence of the community no longer felt protective. It felt conspiratorial, fueled by an ancient, rigid adherence to a twisted sense of honor. Her mind raced, sifting through the years of whispered judgments, the rigid social control, and the pervasive fear of the elders. The truth, whatever it was buried deep beneath 2 years of calculated silence. She clenched her fists. This man, a stranger, was her only chance. The suspense was building, a slow, terrifying realization of the forces arrayed against them. Yes, Sheriff, she said, her voice now steady, a flicker of fierce determination replacing the old dread. I can tell you everything, but you need to understand one thing. In New Inverness, the law is not the badge you wear. The law is the will of Elder MacLeod, and he is a man who values silence above all else. He is the shepherd of a community that believes their isolation makes them immune to the laws of the outside world. A faint, chilling smile touched Thorne's lips. Then we'll make a lot of noise, Miss McLennan, and perhaps we'll find out just how deep this conspiracy of silence goes. He extended a hand. I'll start with the justice of the peace. You start with everything else. Meet me at the assay office tomorrow at noon. It's the only place in town the elders don't frequent. Takatiba. As Ilara turned to leave, the suspense was a physical weight in the air. The long, slow burn of the past was finally threatening to ignite the present. The chilling terror was not of the unknown, but of the calculated malice of man. Before you move on to the next chapter, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the darkest corners of New Inverness, a place where tradition and secrecy breed terror, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Your support helps us uncover more terrifying, real-life mysteries, like the McLennan clan's haunting legacy. Don't miss Chapter 2. Sheriff Thorne's office was a cramped provisional space annexed to the town's small, seldom-used jail. The walls were thin, and he could hear the distinct, heavy footfalls of Elder MacLeod pacing the hallway outside the general store. The elder's presence was a looming, physical pressure, much like the persistent, dry wind that rattled the single-glass window pane. Thorne was systematic. He laid out the McLennan file, 4 brittle pages, mostly containing pre-printed boilerplate language, next to his own pristine, leather-bound notebook. His legal training had taught him that crime rarely happens in a vacuum. It requires motive, opportunity, and, most importantly, in a closed community, protection. The protection here was the collective silence. He'd spent the morning observing justice of the peace grant. Grant was a weak man, a tailor by trade, elevated to his judicial role by the elders not for his legal acumen, but for his pliability. Thorne approached him later that afternoon at his shop. "Mr. Grant," Thorne's voice was polite, yet carried the undeniable authority of the state. "I have a few questions regarding the McLennan fire of '67. Grant, threading a needle, visibly trembled, nearly piercing his thumb. He did not look up. "The matter is settled, Sheriff. Accidental. A great tragedy, but settled by the council." "Settled by you, Justice Grant. Your signature is on the final report." Thorne leaned against the counter, a silent pressure in the small, warm room. "The report states a misplaced lantern caused the blaze, but the McLennan house was known to be meticulously kept. Andrew McLennan was not a careless man by all accounts." "He had been distracted, Sheriff," Grant muttered, finally meeting Thorne's gaze, a brief hunted look before dropping it again. His mind was not on his household duties, too much argument with the elders, questioning the Lord's providence. "It draws down trouble, Sheriff, trouble on one's head." "Trouble or malice?" Thorne pressed. "My diagram of the burned structure shows that both the main door and the secondary door were found secured from the exterior. Not bolted, mind you, but secured with simple, makeshift wooden wedges hammered into the frame." Grant's face turned the color of unbleached linen. His hands stilled, the needle and thread dangling uselessly. I don't recall that detail, Sheriff. There was so much smoke, so much chaos." "You don't recall, or you were told not to see?" Thorne asked softly. This was the precise psychological pressure he sought. Not accusation, but the presentation of an undeniable concrete fact that contradicted the official lie. "To rule an accidental death with that detail present is negligent, Mr. Grant. To omit it is criminal. Which is it?" Grant swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the cool interior of the shop. He glanced frantically toward the window, as if expecting Elder McLeod to materialize. "McLeod," Elder McLeod said. He said the community had suffered enough. The scandal, the public disagreement. The McLennans were trying to split the church, Sheriff. They were trying to bring in outsiders, foreign ideas. He said we had to protect the honor of New Inverness. He said it was done by the hand of God, using an instrument, and that we had to ensure the outside world saw only a tragedy, not a judgment. The word judgment hung in the air, heavy with religious fanaticism and chilling human motive. Thorne kept his expression neutral. "So you are confirming the doors were secured and the omission was deliberate, ordered by Elder McLeod to maintain the community's reputation and enforce the idea of judgment?" Grant crumpled slightly. "I just signed the papers, Sheriff. I just did what I was told to protect the peace. They said the McLennans' ideas were a plague. And right and worse." Thorne didn't need to ask who they were. The elder, the council, and the deep-seated fear of outsiders that defined this settlement. He had his first crack in the wall of silence. He met Ilara at the assay office, a small dark building run by a non-Highlander gold prospector who mostly kept to himself. The man, a gaunt, quiet man named Angus, simply nodded and locked the outer door for privacy. Ilara had brought her own findings, old journals, ledgers, and a tattered family Bible. She spoke in low, measured tones, recounting the escalating tension before the fire. "It wasn't just the trade ideas, Sheriff," Ilara said, laying out a small, meticulously neat ledger. "My father, Andrew, was questioning the community's finances. He found discrepancies in the land sales, especially the grants given to McLeod's own sons for prime tracts near the river. My cousin, Margaret, she was a young teacher, bright. She started a small night class for the workers, teaching things McLeod called secular filth, literature, real history, not just the scriptures and the family lineage. And my mother, she refused to condemn the latest arrival, a small family who had been shunned for marrying outside the clan tradition. She traced a line in the ledger. 2 weeks before the fire, My father threatened to take the evidence of the land fraud, this ledger, to the territorial governor himself. He was going to expose McLeod's control, his nepotism, and his financial corruption. The next morning, McLeod preached a sermon about the dangers of pride and how God often uses a scythe to prune the wicked branches from the tree. The atmosphere in the small office was tight, the terror purely psychological, the methodical abuse of faith and authority to mask greed and murder. Thorne stared at the ledger. Financial corruption, ideological rebellion, and a family that refuses to conform. Motive. They silenced the entire family to preserve their power and their narrative. But why not just exile your father, or kill him alone? Why the others? Ilara's eyes welled up, but she did not cry. Her determination was too strong. My father was prepared for that. The ledger was hidden. The only people who knew where it was, besides him, were my mother and my brother Ian, and my cousin Margaret. They were the witnesses, the collateral. They had to be eliminated for the secret to be truly buried. The McLennan clan, the whole family, was a problem that had to be resolved to secure McLeod's control, Thorne concluded, tapping the ledger. This is not an accident, Miss McLennan. This is a cold, calculated mass murder to prevent a public scandal that would have destroyed the elders' authority and financial standing. And the people who did it are still walking free, protected by a wall of fear. The realization was a crushing blow, yet it also brought a terrible clarity. They were not fighting a memory. They were fighting the living, breathing power structure of New Inverness. We need proof that ties McLeod directly to the act of securing those doors, Ilara, Thorne said, using her first name, a small gesture of alliance. Grant gave us motive and the official cover-up, but we need the hand that swung the hammer. Think. Who else hated your father, but was also loyal enough to McLeod to get their hands dirty? Ilara took a deep, shuddering breath. She thought of the faces at the funeral, the forced solemnity, the absence of genuine grief. She remembered the fire itself, the terrifying heat, the helplessness. And then she remembered a small, insignificant detail that she had dismissed as the confusion of the moment. The night of the fire, she whispered, her voice strained. I remember seeing a figure, standing near the stables, watching the flames. It was far away in the moonlight. He was holding something dark, like a heavy coat, and he was covered in dust, not smoke. And I remember the way he stood, rigid, but I couldn't see his face. Wait. The next morning I was brought to Aunt Morag's. I overheard a conversation between Morag and a man, the local blacksmith, Thomas. Thomas? Thorne prompted, his pen hovering over the paper. Thomas Grant, Justice Grant's son. He was complaining to Morag, not about the fire, but about his hands. He said he'd splintered them doing McLeod's dirty work the night before, and he reeked of something bitter. Turpentine? Or maybe kerosene. The name Thomas Grant resonated in the small assay office, a potential key to unlocking the truth. Thomas, the justice of the peace's son, was a hulking, taciturn man who ran the local forge. His loyalty to Elder McLeod was widely known, driven, Ilara suspected, by a desperate need for the elder's approval, which guaranteed him consistent work from the close-knit community. Thorne knew he couldn't simply arrest the blacksmith. In New Inverness, an accusation against a man in good standing, especially one connected to a powerful family, was an act of war against the elders. He needed to apply pressure, slowly and meticulously, until the man's fear of the law outweighed his fear of McLeod. The next day the weather matched the mood, cold, with a biting wind whipping through the narrow lanes. Thorne went to the forge, the rhythmic clang of Thomas's hammer echoing through the settlement. The air was thick with the smell of scorched iron and coal. Thomas Grant, stripped to the waist, his muscles rippling under a film of sweat and soot, barely glanced at the sheriff. "What do you want, Sheriff?" His voice was a low, grating rumble, rough from years of breathing coal smoke. "Just a word, Thomas, about your work," Thorne said, keeping his tone professional. He looked at the massive, scarred hands that gripped the tongs. They were powerful, but the knuckles were red and raw, scarred with old splinter marks and recent abrasions. "What about it? My work is honest. I shoe horses and mend plows." "I'm sure it is. But I've been looking into the supply contracts for the territory. The rail line is coming through in a few months, and there's a big need for good metal work. Spikes, brackets, rails. New Inverness could land a lucrative contract if the work is up to standard." Thorne was lying, of course. His current priority was not territorial expansion. His words, however, were calculated to appeal to Thomas's financial ambitions, the same ambitions McLeod had exploited in his land deals. Thomas's eyes narrowed, a flicker of interest breaking through his suspicion. "The elders are discussing that. Elder McLeod has connections." "Indeed, McLeod has connections," Thorne agreed, stepping closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "But the territorial office is meticulous. They check for quality and reliability. They also check for integrity. A good reputation is paramount." "Shasput?" Thorne then shifted the conversation with surgical precision. "I was speaking with your father yesterday, Thomas, Justice Grant. He seems worried about the McLennan case. He seems to believe that any hint of a cover-up, especially one involving a public official, could jeopardize the town's chance at that contract. It would certainly raise questions about the McLennan fire, questions about the integrity of the individuals involved in the official report and the actual events of that night." Thomas went still, the only sound the hiss of water hitting hot metal. The sweat on his skin seemed to freeze. "My father is old. He worries over trifles." "Are wedged-shut doors a trifle, Thomas?" Thorne asked, his gaze unwavering. "A door wedged shut from the outside requires someone with strength and determination, someone who knows how to use a hammer, someone who knows how to make a problem permanent. That's not negligence, Thomas. That's malice aforethought. A fire is an accident. Locked doors are a choice. A deadly choice." The suspense was almost unbearable, the confrontation a silent battle of wills, psychological warfare played out against the backdrop of industrial noise. Thomas turned away, slamming the hammer down onto the anvil with a deafening clang that seemed to be an attempt to drown out Thorne's words. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was home that night." "Were you?" "Elora McLennan remembers seeing a man near the stables, covered in dust, not smoke. And she remembers you complaining about splintered hands the next day to her Aunt Morag." "Splintered hands, Thomas? From hammering wooden blocks into door frames?" "Did McLeod promise you a cut of the profits from the new rail contracts if you did his dirty work for him? Did he promise you a clean slate, a chance to be respected in a community that usually just saw you as a brute for hire?" The terror in Thomas's eyes was raw, no longer hidden by anger. It was the terror of a man caught between two absolute unforgiving forces, the sheriff's law and McLeod's iron rule. "It was to protect the town," Thomas finally hissed, his voice cracking, still refusing to look at Thorne. "McLennan was going to bring the law on us. They were going to dissolve the council, take the land, and tear down everything our fathers built." McLeod said McLennan was possessed by a modern demon, an unholy greed that would destroy our way of life. "He used God to justify murder, Thomas, and he used you to carry it out. But he didn't tell you the whole story, did he? He didn't tell you that the land deeds he was protecting were for his own benefit. He didn't tell you that McLennan's ledger, the one that proves the fraud, was secured before the fire. And it survived." Thorne paused, delivering the final calculated blow. "Now, Thomas, a man who assists in a mass murder to cover up financial fraud will not get a lucrative rail contract. He will get a rope, and McLeod will watch him hang, and then claim he was a lone misguided zealot. However, a man who provides evidence against the one truly responsible, who cooperates fully with the territorial authorities, that man is a witness, a useful ally, and a man who gets a chance to walk free and maybe, just maybe, use those strong hands for honest work on the new railroad." The psychological manipulation was complete. Thomas Grant slumped against the anvil, the sheer weight of his betrayal and the imminent consequences finally crushing him. He was a pawn, terrified and now desperate. McLeod didn't tell me. He didn't say the ledger was safe, Thomas mumbled, shaking his head. He told me it was all turned to ash. He made me go back to the site 3 times to look for it. He lied, Thorne confirmed. Now, tell me everything, Thomas. Who else helped you secure the house, and who provided the kerosene? The blacksmith took a deep, rattling breath, the steam rising from his body like a spirit fleeing a tormented soul. There was no kerosene, Sheriff. McLeod said it would be too risky, too obvious. It was something else, something slower, but just as final. He said he had to make sure the evidence and the family were completely destroyed. The oven. The revelation was chilling, far more sinister than a hasty kerosene-fueled blaze. Thomas Grant's confession was a torrent of fear and self-justification, a grim tapestry of religious manipulation and greed. He detailed how Elder McLeod, obsessed with maintaining his absolute power and concealing the land fraud, had devised a terrifying, meticulous plan. The McLennan homestead, like many of the original stone and timber houses, had a large central stone hearth and oven, essential for both cooking and winter heating. He didn't use kerosene, Thomas repeated, the sweat cold on his brow. He had me rig the main stone oven. It was 2 days before the fire. He distracted Andrew McLennan with an emergency council meeting, a fake debate about sheep grazing rights. While Andrew was gone, McLeod provided me with a highly flammable resin, a sticky, thick pitch he'd gotten from a logging contact up north. We were supposed to use it for sealing barrels, but he told me it would ignite timber like dry paper. We coated the interior flue, the wooden mantel, and the internal ceiling joists closest to the hearth. We hid dried prairie kindling in the wood store inside, saturated with the pitch. The methodical nature of the plan was a sickening testament to McLeod's cold, calculated malice. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution by design. And the doors, Thorne pressed, noting down every detail. McLeod and I, we waited until midnight. It was a cold night, just like this one. We saw the lamp go out in the window. Andrew's parents, his brother, his wife, all inside, sleeping. McLeod gave me the wooden blocks. He told me to drive them home, quick and silent. He himself secured the main latch with a length of heavy chain he'd stolen from the church's storage shed, claiming it was for a new bell. That chain, it was the lock, not the blocks. The blocks were just to jam the frames. Thorne felt a wave of cold revulsion. The chain, McLeod's personal, silent signature on the mass murder. He had physically imprisoned the family in the blazing house. Why the chain, Thomas? Why not just the blocks? Because McLeod wanted to be certain, Sheriff. He knew Andrew was a strong man. The wooden blocks might have slowed him. The chain made it impossible. He said, if they are to be judged, they must not be allowed to escape their sentence. He was smiling when he said it, a tight, ugly smile. The level of psychological terror was profound. The victim's own home turned into a tomb by the very man who preached salvation. The immediate problem now was McLeod. With Thomas's confession, Thorne had motive, method, and an accomplice. But McLeod was the center of power. Moving against him required flawless procedure and absolute physical security. Thorne returned to Ilara, who was waiting anxiously in the assay office. He laid out the grim details of the oven and the chain. Ilara listened, her face pale, her hands trembling, but her resolve unbroken. The pitch, the chain, she whispered, the names of her family members seeming to echo in the small room. They didn't have a chance. He made sure of it. McLeod did this to protect a lie, Ilara, Thorne said firmly. He built his power on corruption and maintained it with murder. We can't let him walk, but he's expecting us to move too fast. He will deny everything and accuse Thomas of lying for leniency. He'll play the pious, respected elder against the word of a common blacksmith. His strength is the community's obedience, Ilara pointed out, her thoughts clear despite her distress. No one will testify against him. They are too afraid he'll turn his judgment on them next. Exactly. So we need to show them McLeod's true nature. We need to expose the motive beyond a shadow of a doubt. The ledger you showed me, it proves the financial fraud. We need to link the fraud to a living person within McLeod's trusted circle, someone who directly benefited besides his sons. Alara thought for a moment, her gaze focused on the old family Bible she had brought with her. My father's main argument was against the sale of the South Common land. It was a valuable tract, historically communal grazing land, and my father argued McLeod sold it off too cheaply to his 3 sons. But there was a 4th person mentioned in the council minutes who received a large grant of land adjoining the common, a man named Reverend Alistair McIntyre. The local preacher? Thorne raised an eyebrow. McLeod's spiritual shield? More than that. McIntyre was an intellectual force. He provided the biblical justification for McLeod's hard-line policies, the theological cover. He was the one who coined the phrase, pruning the wicked branches. He gave the murder a religious authority, and he got a massive, valuable tract of land in exchange for his spiritual service to the elders' corruption. The horror deepened. The conspiracy was not just political or financial, it was institutionalized, leveraging the community's deep religious faith to sanction an atrocity. McIntyre is our weakest link, Thorne stated. The financial trail is direct, a clear payoff for his silence and his complicity in providing the moral justification for the crime. Unlike McLeod's sons, who are shielded by family, McIntyre is protected only by his collar and his fear of God's real judgment. We used the ledger and the land deeds to show him that McLeod bought his soul, and that the price was paid in the blood of the McLennans. They devised a plan. Thorne would use the pretense of a routine review of community assets to request a meeting with McIntyre at the church, away from McLeod's direct oversight. Ilara's role was crucial. She would deliver a simple, chilling message to the Reverend prior to the meeting, a message that would strike at his religious conviction and exploit the psychological wedge between him and the murderous elder. That night, the wind howled around Ilara's cabin. The darkness felt immense, heavy with the weight of the conspiracy. But for the first time in 2 years, the haunting silence was broken by the quiet, terrifying sound of truth fighting its way to the surface. The next morning, the bell of the new Inverness church tolled with its familiar, monotonous rhythm, a sound that usually brought comfort but now seemed to toll for the McLennans. Sheriff Thorne walked towards the small, austere stone church for his meeting with Reverend McIntyre. Before Thorne's scheduled appointment, Ilara had played her part. She had found McIntyre in the empty sanctuary, meticulously polishing the altar. His face, usually a study in pious sternness, was drawn and haunted. Ilara approached him silently, placing the small, tattered family Bible on the altar beside his polishing cloth. "My father's Bible, Reverend," Ilara said, her voice low and even, devoid of any anger, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing. He read from 2 Corinthians 5:10 the night before he died. "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad." Pi'kitmore. She paused, letting the verse resonate in the hallowed silence. The fire, Reverend, was not God's judgment on my father's supposed pride. It was man's judgment, administered by McLeod and sanctioned by the theological certainty you provided. You traded the souls of my family for a tract of prime river land, the South Common, a transaction of greed hidden beneath the guise of divine will. She didn't wait for him to respond. She merely tapped the cover of the Bible and left the sanctuary, leaving the Reverend standing frozen before the altar, the weight of his guilt now made physical. When Thorne arrived 20 minutes later, McIntyre was still standing in the same spot. The air in the church was heavy, charged with the psychological tension of a man facing the imminent collapse of his moral and professional life. Thorne did not mince words. He held the McLennan ledger and the official New Inverness land transfer documents. "Reverend McIntyre, I am here to discuss the community's assets, specifically the South Common land transfer of 1867. You received a significant grant of that land shortly after the McLennan family's death. Coincidentally, Mr. Andrew McLennan's ledger, which survived the fire, explicitly details McLeod's fraudulent transfer of the common lands for personal profit. You, Reverend, were the recipient of what amounts to a bribe, a payment for your public justification of McLeod's murderous actions. McIntyre's control was visibly fracturing. He gripped the edge of the altar so tightly his knuckles were white. The land was a donation, Sheriff, for future church use, a recognition of my years of faithful service. The deed states a private, personal grant, Reverend, for your own use, and your sermons preceding the fire speak of the necessity of pruning the wicked branches and of God using violent means to correct the erring. You laid the psychological groundwork for McLeod's murder. You gave him the moral authority to turn a family's home into a funeral pyre, secured with a church chain, a chain that Thomas Grant has confessed to helping McLeod put in place. The name of the accomplice and the detail of the chain broke McIntyre's veneer of piety. He collapsed onto the altar steps, his breath ragged. The chain? Yes, he said it was for the bell. McIntyre gasped, his voice a horrified whisper. I should have known. I should have challenged him, but he has such power, such presence. He convinced me that Andrew McLennan's modern ideas were a spiritual poison. He showed me the financial figures, exaggerated the losses, and made it seem like McLennan was going to destroy the foundation of our entire settlement. He said the community was at stake. The only thing at stake was McLeod's personal wealth and authority, Thorne countered, his voice hard. You chose a tract of land over the truth, and the consequence was the death of an entire family. You are morally complicit in a mass murder, Reverend, regardless of whether you swung the hammer or set the fire. Thorne placed the land deed on the steps beside the Bible. The territorial authorities will see this land transfer as irrefutable evidence of a calculated conspiracy. You have a choice. Stand with the murderer who betrayed your faith, or stand with the truth and the law. If you testify to McLeod's planning, to the religious justification he demanded from you, and to the bribe you accepted, you may be considered an accessory after the fact, or an unwilling pawn. If you remain silent, you are a co-conspirator to murder. McIntyre looked from the ledger, which represented McLeod's cold, hard greed, to the Bible, which represented the God he had betrayed. The internal psychological conflict was a powerful draining force. The terror of facing the law, of losing his position, of God's wrath. It was a devastating dilemma. He controlled everything, McIntyre choked out, tears of shame and fear streaming down his face. The accounts, the council minutes, the sermons. He was preparing the community for the judgment for months. He made me write the official letter of denunciation against Andrew McLennan a week before the fire. The letter of denunciation, Thorne repeated, his mind racing. This was the missing link, the public and documented motive McLeod used to justify the final act of violence to his close circle. Where is that letter now, Reverend? It's filed in the restricted church archive, in the iron box in the vestry. McLeod keeps the only key. McLeod knew he couldn't leave such a damning document in the official town records, Thorne observed. He kept it close, to use as leverage against anyone who might speak out, including you. That letter, Reverend, is your only path to redemption. It proves McLeod's premeditation and your coercion, but you need to get it for me, now, before he suspects you've spoken to me. The Reverend, defeated and terrified, stood up, clutching the Bible. The silence of the church magnified his despair. The iron box. He will kill me if he knows I've touched it. He's always watching. We will protect you, Thorne promised, though he knew the promise was thin. In New Inverness, McLeod's reach seemed to extend further than the law. The choice is yours. Face McLeod's earthly wrath, or God's eternal one. Which one do you fear more, Reverend? The Reverend McIntyre's face hardened with a terrible, desperate resolve. The key? He keeps it in a small, concealed compartment in his study desk. Behind the large portrait of his father, he's gone to the settlement north of here for the day. He won't be back until sundown. We must be quick. The psychological suspense ratcheted up. They now had a concrete physical piece of evidence to retrieve, but it required a risky break-in into the elders' private, heavily secured domain. The urgency was a cold, driving force. Thorne, Ilara, and a now visibly distraught Reverend McIntyre moved with the stealth of criminals rather than agents of justice. MacLeod's house, a large, imposing structure of dark stone, stood on the highest point of New Inverness, a silent architectural testament to his dominance. "The study is on the ground floor, facing the back garden," McIntyre whispered, his hand shaking as he directed them through the twilight. The clouds were thick, and a fine cold rain had begun to fall, muffling the sounds of their approach. The atmospheric pressure was immense, reflecting the high-stakes risk they were taking. "We have very little time," Thorne said, checking the loaded pistol concealed beneath his coat. "Thomas Grant is secure in the jail, but his silence is fragile. MacLeod must be arrested and charged before he learns of the confession. The letter is the final piece of irrefutable evidence, proof of premeditation." They entered through a small, unlocked back pantry door. A detail that McIntyre revealed was a habit of MacLeod's wife, a small rebellion against her husband's constant vigilance. The interior of the elder's home was opulent by New Inverness standards, yet oppressively dark, filled with heavy, uninviting furniture. Every room felt like a vault. They reached the study. It was dominated by a massive mahogany desk and a large portrait, painted in severe tones, of the elder's father, a man whose rigid gaze seemed to follow them across the room. "Behind the portrait," McIntyre rasped, pointing a shaking finger, "the small compartment." Thorne carefully lifted the heavy portrait. Behind it, carved expertly into the wall paneling, was a small, almost invisible wooden door with a tiny brass pull. He used a knife to pry it open, revealing a velvet-lined recess. Inside lay a single heavy key, the key to the church archive's iron box. "We have it," Thorne murmured, pocketing the key. "Now, the church. Ilara, you and the Reverend wait here. Keep watch. If anyone approaches, give a single cough. I will go fast." "No, Sheriff," Ilara said, her voice firm. She had faced this fear for 2 years. She would not wait now. "I know the church better than you. I know the drafts and the creaking floorboards. I go with you. The Reverend must stay here. If he leaves the house, MacLeod might notice him missing from his usual routine when he returns." Thorne considered her for a moment. Her resolve was palpable. She was the protagonist, driven by an authentic, desperate need for justice. "Very well, but stay in the shadow of the pews. You only watch." The church vestry was cold and damp. The air smelled of old paper and dust. The iron box, a relic from the original settlers, was built into the wall behind a curtain. Thorne inserted the heavy key, and the lock turned with a loud metallic thunk that echoed terrifyingly in the stillness. Inside, beneath ledgers and ceremonial cloths, lay the sealed, brittle paper, the official letter of denunciation, signed by Elder MacLeod and co-signed by Reverend McIntyre. Thorne pulled it out, his fingers careful not to damage the evidence. He unfolded the document in the pale moonlight filtering through the small window. The language was venomous, a twisted masterpiece of spiritual abuse. "To the community of New Inverness, let it be known that Andrew McLennan and his house are judged by the Council to be vessels of corrosive modern pride, a pestilence that seeks to fracture the pious unity of our forebears. He has been given ample warning to renounce his wicked financial pursuits and secular teachings, but he refuses the true path. Let his path be severed, his counsel disregarded, and his soul put to the final test. May God remove this blight from our midst for the survival of the righteous." Signed, Elder Fergus MacLeod. This was it, the official sanction for murder. "He wrote their death warrant," Ilara whispered from the shadow of the pews, reading the script over Thorne's shoulder. The terror of the realization, the pure human evil behind the words, was a chilling punch. Just as Thorne was refolding the letter, a sound, a distinct, heavy boot scuffing against the stone outside, sent a shockwave through the vestry. "Someone's here!" "That's not the Reverend's step," Ilara hissed, pulling Thorne back behind the heavy wooden door. They stood, suspended in absolute silence. The footsteps grew louder, moving not towards the vestry, but into the main sanctuary. "Ilara," Thorne mouthed, pointing to the window. "Look." Ilara crept to the small, dusty pane. A figure stood silhouetted against the weak moonlight near the altar. It was a man, large and hunched, but it wasn't McLeod. It was Thomas Grant. He shouldn't be here. He was supposed to be in the jail cell. "He's escaped," Thorne breathed, drawing his pistol. "The jailer must be one of McLeod's men. He's coming for McIntyre. He knows what the Reverend has done." But Thomas didn't move towards the vestry. He stood over the altar, his posture one of immense grief. Then he raised his massive hands and, with a guttural cry of pure anguish, smashed the brass altar lamp to the stone floor. He wasn't hunting McIntyre. He was consumed by guilt, destroying the symbols of the faith that had betrayed him. "He's breaking," Ilara said, her voice trembling. "His guilt is destroying him. He's not thinking clearly." "We can't rely on that," Thorne countered. "If he finds the Reverend gone, he'll head straight to McLeod's house. He's a loose end. We need to secure McIntyre and then confront McLeod. The elder is back. The door was unlocked. We have to assume he's returned." The time for subtlety was over. They had the evidence. Now they needed to use it to secure their main conspirators. The race against time and against a murderous elder and a desperate, guilt-ridden accomplice was on. Thorne and Ilara slipped out of the church as Thomas Grant continued his destructive, mournful rampage inside the sanctuary. The fear was acute. McLeod's control was not just ideological, but had infiltrated the very structure of the law, the jailer. This underscored the authentic, immediate danger they faced. They returned to McLeod's house, their hearts pounding in unison with the rhythmic clatter of the shutters in the increasing wind. They found Reverend McIntyre exactly where they left him, cowering in the study. "Thomas Grant escaped the jail," Thorne announced, his voice clipped and serious. "He's at the church. He is distraught, possibly dangerous. McLeod must be back. Was the house disturbed when we returned?" "No, Sheriff," McIntyre stammered, "but the back door is now locked, and I heard movements upstairs, heavy steps. He's here." The atmosphere inside the study was a suffocating blend of dread and high tension. The predator was home, and they were trapped in his lair. "We can't wait," Thorne decided, securing the letter of denunciation and the ledger safely inside his coat. "If McLeod realizes McIntyre is missing or sees Thomas's actions at the church, we lose the element of surprise. We confront him now. The strength of the law, Ilara, is its certainty. We must use the evidence like a weapon." Thorne pushed the door open, moving into the main hall. He yelled up the stairs, his voice echoing with official authority, demanding immediate attention. "Elder McLeod, this is Sheriff Elias Thorne. I have reason to question you regarding the land transfer records and the McLennan tragedy of 1867. You are required to come down and submit to questioning immediately." A moment of silence, thick and absolute, followed. Then the sound of slow, heavy footsteps descending the main staircase. Elder Fergus McLeod appeared, a man who physically embodied the rigid authority of New Inverness. He was tall, with a stern, angular face, and eyes that held a cold, unwavering zealotry. He wore a traditional dark suit, immaculate and heavy, which seemed to resist the very dust of the prairie. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, looking down with an expression of contempt that encompassed Thorne, Ilara, and the trembling McIntyre, who shuffled out behind them. "You show a great deal of disrespect, Sheriff." McLeod's voice was a low, resonant baritone, perfectly controlled. "Barging into a man's home, accusing him of what? Questioning land records. The McLennan business was settled 2 years ago. An act of God, a fault of the victim's own pride. You are an outsider. You do not understand the laws or the traditions of this community." "I understand murder, Elder," Thorne countered, planting his feet firmly on the polished wood floor, "and I understand financial fraud. We have the ledger detailing your illegal transfer of the South Common, and we have the land deeds that prove you bought Reverend McIntyre's silence and his spiritual blessing for your crimes." McLeod's jaw tightened, but his expression remained dangerously calm. "The boy is a fool, Sheriff, a newcomer. You have been poisoned by the lies of the McLennan girl, who is quite clearly unbalanced by grief. The ledger is a forgery, a desperate attempt by a wayward family to discredit their betters." "Is the letter of denunciation also a forgery, Elder?" Thorne asked, pulling the brittle paper from his coat and snapping it open. The sound was startlingly loud in the tense silence. "The one you wrote a week before the fire, outlining the McLennan family's final test and your desire for God to remove this blight? The letter you kept hidden in the church archives with your private key? The document that proves your murderous intent was premeditated?" McLeod's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. His eyes flashed with a cold, terrifying fury directed at McIntyre. "The preacher, you traitorous serpent! You dared to touch the archive. You will burn for this, McIntyre, both in this life and the next." "He is under the protection of the territorial law, Elder," Thorne interjected, stepping slightly in front of McIntyre, "and so is Miss McLennan. You are under arrest for the mass murder of the McLennan family, the concealment of evidence, and financial corruption. You have the right to remain silent, a right I suggest you exercise, because everything you have done is now exposed." The psychological terror of the confrontation was at its peak. The elder, confronted with the collapse of his absolute power, his righteous mask now replaced by the grimace of a desperate criminal. But McLeod did not immediately submit. He began to descend the remaining steps, slowly, deliberately, his eyes burning with a frightening, intense focus. "You think a piece of paper and the word of a frightened man and a hysterical girl can dismantle the foundation of a society, Sheriff?" McLeod sneered, reaching the bottom step. "You are naive. This is New Inverness. We protect our own. And the McLennan family had a darkness that the community decided had to be purged." "The darkness was in your heart, Elder," Alara said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, the sound of truth finally being spoken after 2 years of silence. The sight of her, the sole survivor confronting the man who killed her family, was emotionally shattering. "Silence, girl! You know nothing!" McLeod roared, his controlled demeanor completely gone. He lunged suddenly, not for Thorne, but for the bewildered Reverend McIntyre, a desperate act of silencing the weakest witness. Thorne reacted instantly, pulling his pistol. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, a sharp crack that broke the oppressive silence of the house and the community. McLeod stumbled, not from a bullet, but from the shock of the blast. He recoiled, his hand gripping his chest, not wounded but utterly stunned. The shot was aimed not at McLeod but at the wall beside his head, a decisive act of authority that was purely psychological. "The time for your judgments is over, Elder," Thorne stated, the smoking pistol steady in his hand. "You are coming with me now." The confrontation had been won not by physical force, but by the relentless application of documented, irrefutable truth. McLeod, defeated, stood panting, his grand authority shattered by the evidence in Thorne's hand. Just as Thorne was about to secure the elder, a violent banging erupted from the front door. Thomas Grant, having finished his destructive act at the church, had come to the elder's house. He was their one loose, unpredictable variable. "Open the door, McLeod! I know you're in there!" Thomas bellowed, the sound of his massive frame hitting the wood. "I saw the sheriff's horse. You're going to pin this on me. You're going to let me hang while you walk free. You promised me honor." Thorne looked at Ilara. "We have the elder, but we have a mob forming at the gate. If Thomas gets in, this becomes a bloodbath. We need to secure them both and get out before the rest of McLeod's loyalists rally. If you're captivated by the psychological terror and the relentless pursuit of justice in New Inverness, remember to like this video, share it with others who love a great mystery, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You don't want to miss the shocking final chapters where the ultimate secrets of the McLennan tragedy are fully exposed. The escalating chaos outside McLeod's door injected a frantic, brutal energy into the confrontation. The psychological terror had spilled over into immediate, physical danger. Thomas Grant's hammering on the oak door was a desperate, syncopated rhythm to the rapid thumping of Thorn's heart. "McLeod," Thorn commanded, his voice sharp and precise, "if you do not instruct your accomplice to stand down, I will use necessary force. You are responsible for every action taken here tonight." McLeod, his eyes still glittering with fanatical rage, was trapped. His authority had evaporated, replaced by the raw fear of exposure and imprisonment. He was a cornered animal. "Thomas, stand down, go home," McLeod roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and continued dominance. "This outsider, this man of the Eastern secular law, has polluted our sanctuary. Do not submit." Thomas's response was a fresh volley of desperate pounding. "You promised me a place. You promised me a future. You used me, McLeod, and I killed that family for you. Now they'll hang me." The confession, shouted through the heavy door, echoed with the brutal clarity of truth. Ilara stood near the shattered remnants of the altar lamp, her face grim, the sound of her family's murder being confessed just feet away. Thorn knew they couldn't wait for the inevitable breach. He shoved McLeod and the sobbing McIntyre into the study, locking the heavy door with a quick final thrust. "Ilara, the back door. The stables," Thorn instructed, already moving. "My horse is tethered there. We have to get both prisoners out of the community before the Loyalists surround the house. The town will not allow its elder to be taken." As they reached the pantry, the front door finally splintered with a sickening crack. Thomas Grant burst in, a massive, guilt-crazed figure, his eyes glazed with a mixture of fury and despair. He held a length of iron rebar, seized from his forge, a lethal, improvised weapon. Thomas saw the open study door, but before he could move, he saw Ilara. The sight of the survivor, the living embodiment of his monstrous crime, stopped him cold. "Ilara," he whispered, the sound a mix of pain and horror. I didn't want the children." "You sealed the doors, Thomas," Ilara said, her voice a desolate whisper, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You sealed my brother in, for a piece of land and a word of praise from that monster." The confrontation was intensely personal, a moment of raw, authentic psychological horror. Thomas's face contorted, the guilt and the terror of his impending fate clashing violently. He lunged, not at Ilara, but at the portrait of McLeod's father on the desk, smashing the rebar through the canvas in a final futile attempt to destroy the symbol of the oppression that had ruined him. Thorn seized the moment of distraction, slamming the iron rebar to the side with a swift movement and tackling the heavy blacksmith to the ground. The fight was quick and brutal, a struggle against pure, uncontrolled power. Thorn, using technique over brute force, managed to bind Thomas's wrists with a length of rope he carried, securing him beside the desk. "We have them both," Thorn stated, breathing heavily, "McLeod and his main accomplice. Now we move." They quickly secured McLeod and McIntyre, binding their hands and covering their mouths with cloth to prevent them from raising an alarm. The scene was one of grim, desperate triumph. The pillars of New Inverness society, the elder, the preacher, and the loyal blacksmith, now bound prisoners in the heart of their shattered authority. "The wagon will be too slow," Thorn decided. "We take the horses. We ride hard for the territorial seat, 30 miles, no rest." They led the 3 prisoners, one by one, out the back door and towards the stables. The air was thick with the cold, driving rain, and the distant murmur of the town beginning to stir. As they reached the stable doors, Ilara turned back for a final look at the house. In the faint moonlight, she saw the shattered portrait and the locked study door. The psychological weight of the 2 years of silence and suppression was finally lifting, but the danger was far from over. As Thorn was mounting his horse, a shot rang out, not from a pistol, but the distinct heavier sound of a hunting rifle. The bullet struck the wooden post near Thorn's shoulder, sending a shower of splinters into the air. "The jailer!" Thorn cursed, pulling the reins. He's seen us! Ride, Elara, now!" They galloped out of the stables and onto the open prairie, pushing the horses to their limit. McLeod's furious, muffled cries and the distant echo of the rifle shot were swallowed by the vast, open land. The ride was a blur of fear and adrenaline. Elara, riding beside Thorn, kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, the darkness of New Inverness receding behind them. The escape was successful, but the final terrifying truth remained to be secured. "We made it out," Elara yelled over the wind. "The evidence is safe." "Not yet," Thorn shouted back. "We have the men and the documents, but we need the final piece of the motive, the real, darkest secret of the McLennan clan." McLeod mentioned a darkness they decided to purge. It's more than just financial fraud and modern ideas. There is a deeper reason why he had to eliminate every single member of the family. The ultimate truth, the hidden motive, still lay concealed beneath McLeod's fanatical zealotry. They had achieved justice, but they had not yet understood the full, monstrous measure of the crime. The ride to the territorial seat was a grueling, tense ordeal through the unforgiving prairie night. Thorn, Elara, and their 3 prisoners, the silent, defeated McLeod, the sobbing McIntyre, and the guilt-ridden Thomas Grant, rode in desperate silence. By dawn they reached the small, temporary wooden courthouse that served the territory's judicial needs. The judge, a stern, fair man named Judge Harrington, was awakened and immediately took the matter seriously upon seeing the formidable evidence and the prisoners. Thorn presented the McLennan ledger, the land deeds, the letter of denunciation, and the signed confession of Thomas Grant. The case for calculated mass murder and conspiracy was airtight. McLeod remained silent, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his demeanor cold and impenetrable. Judge Harrington, after reviewing the evidence, turned to the elder. "Elder McLeod, the evidence suggests a premeditated murder orchestrated by you, motivated by greed, and the preservation of your corrupt authority. Do you have anything to say?" McLeod finally spoke, his voice low and chillingly calm, imbued with a final desperate attempt at self-justification. "I acted to preserve a fundamental truth, Judge, a truth that man's law cannot comprehend. I protected New Inverness from a poison far worse than financial fraud." "What poison?" Thorn demanded, stepping forward. "Tell the court the real reason you murdered that family. It was not enough to discredit Andrew. You had to kill his wife, his brother, his children. Why?" McLeod looked at Elara, a horrifying mix of pity and cold conviction in his eyes. The McLennan family was not simply modernizing, they were tainted. Andrew McLennan's wife, Isabel, was descended from the second line, a line that had been warned years ago to never intermarry with the established, pure New Inverness blood. She brought a weakness, a psychological flaw, a deviancy of the mind that threatened to undermine the entire fabric of our faith and community. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes flashing with zeal. Isabel McLennan suffered from a persistent, debilitating melancholy, a sadness that she claimed was inherited. The elders, my father among them, had always maintained that such mental weakness, such melancholy, was a sign of God's disfavor, a psychological vulnerability that could corrupt the strong. They called it the whispering shadow. Isabel's condition worsened after the birth of her second child. The council feared it would be passed on, that the McLennan name would become a vessel for inherited madness that would destroy the community's stoic reputation and spiritual resolve. I was tasked by my late father to ensure the community was never tainted. The revelation was shocking, a purely psychological terror. The murder was driven not just by greed, but by a chilling form of eugenics masked in religious fear and ancient superstition about mental health. McLeod didn't just want to stop Andrew's political ideas. He wanted to eradicate the entire bloodline, which he believed carried a dangerous, debilitating hereditary weakness. Elara was reeling, her mother's quiet, persistent sadness now cast in a terrifying new light. She had always thought it was the burden of the community's isolation. The two cousins, McLeod, Thorne pressed, his voice taut with disgust. Why did they have to die? They were Isabel's sister's children. They, too, carried the weakness, McLeod stated, his logic terrifyingly consistent. The entire branch had to be pruned. It was a terrible necessity. They were too far gone to be saved and too dangerous to be allowed to propagate in our perfect settlement. The true darkest secret of the McLennan clan was not a crime they committed, but a psychological vulnerability they carried, which the elders deemed a stain upon their community's perfect, rigid honor, a stain they were willing to commit mass murder to erase. Judge Harrington, a man of modern law, stared at McLeod with utter revulsion. Your fear of a hereditary melancholy is the basis for a systematic, cold-blooded execution, disguised as a divine judgment. You used the church and your authority to commit an atrocity. This is not justice. It is the ultimate expression of human control and psychological abuse. I ask that the town of New Inverness be allowed to see the evidence, Elara said, stepping forward, her voice resonating with fierce dignity, despite the fresh emotional trauma. McLeod's power was built on silence and fear. The people must know the truth, that their elder murdered an entire family, not because of God, but because of his own twisted, cruel fear of a woman's sadness and the loss of his own financial power. Judge Harrington agreed. The evidence, the ledger, the letter, the confession, would be taken back to New Inverness and publicly posted. The full, terrifying scope of the McLennan tragedy would finally be exposed. McLeod, his eyes vacant, had one final terrifying comment. He looked directly at Elara. The darkness runs in the blood, Elara. You are the last. It will find you, and you will understand. I did what I had to do for the survival of the community. The implication was chilling. Elara herself was now burdened with the whispering shadow, the hereditary melancholy that had been the ultimate motive for the murder of her entire family. The psychological terror, the sense of an inescapable internal threat, was now focused entirely on her. The return journey to New Inverness was slow and deliberate, no longer a desperate flight, but a measured march toward justice. Sheriff Thorne, accompanied by a small contingent of territorial marshals, brought the damning evidence and the judge's official proclamation. Elara rode with them, no longer the ostracized orphan, but the crucial witness and survivor. The weather had cleared, but the atmosphere in New Inverness was heavy, a suffocating silence that preceded a storm. Word of McLeod's arrest and the involvement of the territorial law had spread like wildfire. A small crowd had gathered in the town square, a mix of loyalists, skeptics, and the deeply frightened. Thorne stood on the steps of the general store, the evidence held high. He read the judge's proclamation, detailing the methodical nature of McLeod's crimes, the financial fraud, the religious manipulation, the calculated, premeditated use of the oven and the church chain to commit mass murder, and the chilling motive, the eradication of the McLennan bloodline due to McLeod's fanatic fear of Isabel McLennan's hereditary melancholy. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The community's foundation of faith and trust, built on McLeod's rigid authority, shattered. The Loyalists initially cried out in denial, but the evidence, the very chain that secured the door, now presented as evidence, and Thomas Grant's signed confession, was irrefutable and immediate. The most profound reaction came from the women. They had endured McLeod's rigid control for decades, his judgments dictating every aspect of their lives. The realization that their elder had murdered a family over a melancholy that many of them quietly struggled with, the pervasive sadness that came with the isolation and harshness of prairie life, was a devastating betrayal. The Reverend McIntyre, now broken and terrified, stood before the crowd and offered a tearful, desperate confession of his coercion and his complicity, solidifying the guilt of the elder. The community, stripped of its leader and its moral compass, erupted into a chaotic blend of grief, anger, and shock. MacLeod's rule was definitively over. Thorne ensured the immediate dismantling of the town council and the arrest of the complicit jailer. Justice was served with professional finality. The McLennan tragedy was no longer a buried scandal, but a public, agonizing wound. The true terror was the realization of how easily and thoroughly human malevolence, when cloaked in authority and religion, could dismantle life and trust. Days later, MacLeod and Thomas Grant were transferred to the capital for trial. MacLeod remained cold and unrepentant, still convinced of his divine mission. Thomas Grant, consumed by guilt and the prospect of the rope, finally broke down, providing further grim details of the night that would seal their fate. Hilary stood by the charred patch of earth that had once been her home. The persistent scent of ash finally seemed to be fading, replaced by the clean, cold smell of true prairie earth. The silence of the community was no longer oppressive. It was a profound, respectful quiet, the sound of a community beginning the long, painful process of healing. Hilary had achieved justice, but she was left with the final psychological challenge. MacLeod's last chilling words about the whispering shadow, the inherited melancholy. Was it a real, debilitating psychological weakness, or simply MacLeod's final desperate attempt to plant a seed of doubt and terror in her mind? She walked to the edge of the settlement where the prairie met the sky. She felt the weight of her grief, the sadness of her mother's suffering, and the immense burden of being the last of the McLennan name. The melancholy, the whispering shadow, was there, a palpable ache in her heart. But it was not a curse. It was grief. It was the trauma of loss, and it was a human emotion. She finally understood the distinction. MacLeod had demonized a natural human condition, sadness, introspection, vulnerability, to justify murder and maintain his brutal control. The terror was not the melancholy itself, but the fear of it, a fear MacLeod had successfully weaponized. Hilary looked back at New Inverness, a community now forced to reckon with its dark past and rebuild its future without the rigid shield of false honor. She had been the protagonist who, with the help of a dedicated ally, had exposed the conspiracy, faced the killer, and lifted the ancient curse of silence. She had secured the justice her family deserved, but her future lay elsewhere. The vast, challenging American West was no place for secrets. Taking a deep breath of the clear, cold air, Hilary turned her back on the settlement. She carried the McLennan legacy not as a burden of darkness, but as a commitment to truth, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of authentic human connection. She walked towards the horizon, the sole survivor carrying the devastating real history of the darkest family the Nova Scotia Highlanders had tried to bury in silence. The psychological terror had been unmasked as human evil, and the long road to personal healing was finally beginning.